So, did you hear in the opening lines of the gospel today this list of really important people, really kind of muckety-mucks, right? The emperor, all the way from the emperor through Herod and Philip to the high priests of the temple. In some ways, Luke likes to do this. He does this earlier in the gospel and he does it here. And in some senses, it's simply a time and place marker. It's historical, telling you what moment this all happened. And reassuring us or insisting to us that this was a real historical moment. But more importantly, I think, than that, is we quickly dismiss all these important people and all these important figures. It's as if the camera kind of moves along for these. It focuses its gaze on one man, John, who was the son of Zechariah. And you'll remember that Zechariah was a provincial priest. So John is the son of this priest of the provinces, who would come once in a while when it was their turn to Jerusalem, Zechariah would, to serve in the temple. But for the rest of the year, he lived what was likely a fairly obscure life in the countryside. Yet he and his son will play a part in God's plan for the universe. It's not the emperor, not the governor, not the high priest, but John, who will be the one calling from the wilderness, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord." And John will be the one proclaiming this baptism, this cleansing for the forgiveness of sin. John is down by the Jordan. It's the same river that the Israelites crossed to enter the promised land. That was their first baptism in those waters. But now it's time to go again to the banks of the Jordan. And remember where John is. It's not that far from Jerusalem. We know this because in other texts it says that many from Jerusalem will go down to see him, the scribes and the Pharisees. And John will say to them, "Be washed," because something new is happening. God is up to something new. Something that may not yet have reached the ears of the emperor, but did reach the ears of the Jewish governor Herod. But in his case, it was an accusation that John made that he was breaking the law. He was accusing Herod of this sin. And in this case, it was the sin, this rupture of the covenantal relationship with God. Remember, the Jewish law structured the community. It taught right relationships among each other, but it did so because those right relationships were a reflection of how we are toward God and how God is toward the community. So yes, Herod, you probably remember, was accused of rupturing a marriage relationship. Remember, I think he married his cousin or something, which was against the law. But that was not the only thing. It wasn't like he was just wagging a finger at Herod. John was saying to him, you have ruptured the relationship in the community and in relationship to God. This wasn't just some private sin. Herod's behavior reflects the relationship of God's people to God. And what did Herod do to John? You remember, right? The party, all those people gathered around, and he even had his daughter, I think it was his stepdaughter or something, but anyway, she was dancing, and Salome, right? And then he makes this prideful boast, anything you want, my dear. And I'm sure he was drunk. And then he ordered John beheaded in front of all his invited guests, who were all important people. And so that's not the new thing that's happening, right? That's not new. The powerful preserving their power through violence and lies. That's not the new thing. But there is something new in the land. And John proclaims it. Make straight the path, the highway for our God. John is calling us to prepare. John is calling us to our conversion, our metanoia, as you guys probably have heard in the past. That metanoia is that Greek word that we translate as conversion, which really means a kind of change of mind, a turning around, not just for our own salvation. It is making straight the path so that God and God's people may enter the promised land. That's the reference from Isaiah. It's making straight the path for the exiles to come back to Israel. So this conversion that we're talking about is not just for our own little inner, it's partly for our inner peace, etc., of course, but really our conversion is meant to spread to the whole community, to remake the community of God, that we might ourselves enter together this promised land, this promised future. Because this future that we are promised is supposed to influence how we act in the present, how we see what's going on in the present. Does our city look like this city of God that is coming from the book of Revelation on the clouds, coming down to earth? And how can we prepare for its coming? Because that is what is coming, and that is who is coming, God and God's reign of heaven. And as the divine enters into our reality should not remain as it was, should not remain static, because our reality, when God comes in, buckles and shakes in response to the coming of God. The earth quakes, the sun darkens, the waters flood, as even the created order comes into this new relationship with God and the divine power. Now we, in our turning, we have no power to shake the rocks of creation, but we can shake up and reorder our relationships to each other. And so people will come to John. We'll read about this next week. They'll come to John and they'll ask him, well, what must we do to change? And he'll say some fairly simple things. He'll say, stop extorting people. Speak rightly and don't lie. Share your goods with the poor. So what must we do to change? It's our time now to practice generosity, to speak rightly and truthfully, to think, what is the loving thing to do or say in this moment, and to be grateful. So I heard this story the other day. Marge, who is my wife and who is the organizer of Justice Knox, one of the pastors, wrote her an email, and she told me about the contents of the email. One of the things they're working on this year, which is a big thing to take on, is gun violence. And this is an event that happened to this pastor just a couple days ago. He spoke of the hearing gunfire. And he spoke of these boys that were running from a neighbor yard, through his yard and away. And next came his son running towards him, with a look of kind of terror on his face. And I guess he didn't see his dad. His dad must have been kind of hidden from him as he was running. But his dad saw this terror, and he called to his son and comforted his son. But he told Marge that he was also filled with questions and filled with his own fears and filled with compassion for his son and filled, of course, with some anger. This gunfire, he said, was in a neighborhood that's not too far from ours, right? Here in Knoxville. This isn't a story about New York City or something. This is a story about here in Knoxville. So making straight the paths, I think, does not simply mean paving potholes and cleaning up the garbage and moving the homeless away from the sight lines of our parades. It means making real change. Making it so that no one's son needs to run in terror from random gunfire. No one's daughter needs to lose a classmate to violence. No one's neighborhood is overrun with weapons. And it means that we must look to ourselves and to act as incarnations of this divine power. Making straight the paths means reordering our society, that our relationships are not based on lies and injustice or exploitation. Our choices are not made with reference only to our own individual wants and needs, but we must think of the common good, of communion, of community. For the road Isaiah speaks of was a highway not just for God, but for God's people, for everyone, for all flesh, for the making straight the paths and the smoothing of the rough places. It is in that work that with God's grace we will make God's kingdom. It's the very incarnation of the city of God, and it's our salvation. Amen.